Hi, I'm Kyle Kittleson with MedCircle, joined today by Dr. Judy Ho. Dr. Judy, it is always wonderful to see you. Thanks for being here today.
Love seeing you too, Kyle. Thanks for having me.
Now, we're talking about paranoia and specifically paranoid personality disorder. Let's start with your definition of paranoia as it comes from a neuro and forensic psychologist.
Well, paranoia is a thought process that causes a person to have an irrational suspicion or mistrust of other people. And people with paranoia might feel like they're being persecuted, that people are following them, that people are out to harm them or to get them. And they feel that threat of harm, even if they're not truly in danger. And sometimes it can be really difficult to talk sense into these people when they're in the middle of a paranoid episode, because for them, it feels very real. But for the people around them, they say, no, this is not actually being reflected in reality. And that can obviously cause a lot of distress for the person suffering the paranoia, but also difficulties in navigating their relationships.
What are the potential mental health causes of paranoia and of paranoid personality disorder?
So there's a number of different types of causes or risk factors for paranoia. And paranoia as a symptom is something that oftentimes can arise during a very significantly stressful time in a person's life. That's not the only risk factor. Usually there's kind of a combination of maybe some familial risk or biological risk on top of what we call environmental or situational risk. And so the most common type of environmental or situational risk is extreme stress. And then the other most common type of environmental risk is actually drugs. The effects of certain types of recreational drugs have been known to essentially precipitate a paranoid episode. And the ones that are most associated with this are different classes of stimulants like cocaine, even too much Adderall, or even for some individuals, again, who have a real biological sensitivity, extreme amounts of caffeine. And
Oh,
so, yeah. So, I mean, again, this is really a buildup. It's not that if you just have a lot of caffeine, you could just completely become paranoid. It's that usually there might be already a biological risk factor that's underlying that perhaps you didn't know was there. But a very, very stressful event or a type of substance can then provoke that particular biological predisposition and cause a paranoid episode.
got you. Very interesting. Now, how do you differentiate between paranoia versus another mental health issue versus paranoid personality disorder?
So, paranoia is a class of symptoms. And as we described earlier, it's really a class of symptoms that's based very much in fear and this idea that people are out to get you and that perhaps people are trying to persecute you or harm you in some way. And that could actually arise from a number of different types of conditions or disorders. So somebody who has untreated PTSD may exhibit some paranoia. Someone who has schizophrenia or bipolar disorder with psychotic features could exhibit paranoia. But as you can see, it's transdiagnostic. It's not a symptom that is only assigned to one type of condition. Paranoid personality disorder is more specific. It's actually a group of conditions that falls under what we used to call cluster A personality disorders in the DSM. And all of these cluster A personality disorders involve odd or eccentric ways of thinking that are not fully rooted in reality. And so people with paranoid personality disorder, this is more of like a long-term characteristic that they have across multiple situations, across multiple people or multiple timeframes in their life. And the key is that they do have this unrelenting mistrust and suspicion of others. And we see that paranoid personality disorder tends to have its roots in late teens or early adulthood. They are more common in men than in women. And in general, people with paranoid personality disorder, they're always on guard. They're kind of very hyper vigilant to any kind of cues that other people might be trying to demean, harm, or threaten them. even if they don't necessarily have a reason to suspect this person. And it becomes more of like a habit or a characteristic that is associated with this individual. They tend to be very hypersensitive whenever they get criticized. They take that very poorly. And generally, they read more into social interactions than the average person. And usually, the way they interpret it is never favorable to themselves. It's about, this person is trying to slight me in some way or trying to make me look bad in some way.
Two follow-up questions on that. First, are personality disorders typically diagnosed at a young age, or are they diagnosed after the age of 18, for example?
Generally, personality disorders are diagnosed after the age of 18 because the idea is that personality doesn't really even start to form into something that's cohesive and consistent until somebody becomes an adult. And then, of course, it develops for many, many years after that. Your personality is always shifting throughout your lifetime, but the most significant shifts tend to happen between the late teens to the late 20s. Again, does not mean that in your 30s, your personality still might not shift a little bit, but in that major time period, there's very major developmental milestones of personality traits. And so generally, we don't see somebody being diagnosed at the age of 18. And if they were, it would really be a diagnosis of a provisional type, meaning this is what I think this person might have, but we got to see how they do for the next 6 months to a year or even 2 years. And if we really see this long-term habit or characteristic develop more and more, then we can feel more secure in this diagnosis. And so generally, people with paranoid personality disorder usually aren't even getting that diagnosis until their late 20s, sometimes in their 30s, sometimes in their 40s. And the interesting thing about all personality disorders is that they're not just showing up getting treatment for paranoid personality disorder. There's usually something else that they're dealing with. Maybe it's depression, maybe it's substance abuse. So they go to treatment, maybe by themselves or at the behest of the loved ones that say you need treatment. But there's not a lot of insight that a personality disorder might actually be the underpinnings of a lot of their distress.
For someone living with paranoid personality disorder, let's assume that they've received that diagnosis. Do they believe that diagnosis, or does the disorder prevent them from trusting that diagnosis?
Well, it's a very good question, Kyle. And I think that in general, all personality disorders are a little tough for the person being diagnosed to accept them. That's sort of a hallmark symptom, cross-diagnostic symptom of all personality disorders, that there's a kind of a poor insight about their own personality condition. Of course, there's exceptions to that rule, but in general, people don't really understand that and kind of feel like they're being blamed. And so to your very good point, when somebody has a paranoid personality disorder and you try to diagnose them with such a condition, that could amp up their paranoia even more. The idea that people are out to harm them and that they're just trying to find a way to criticize them and label them. And that could really cause some difficulties, not only in relationships, but also the therapeutic process and trusting the therapist to be able to help them with whatever it is that they need help with.
Well, certainly relationships are impacted in all, mental health discussions, and paranoid personality disorder is no exception. What type of difficulties are you seeing when one person in a relationship is living with PPD?
Well, in a romantic relationship, the most common thing that we see with paranoid personality disorder is that they tend to have recurrent suspicions without any reason that their spouse or lover is being unfaithful to them. That can obviously cause a lot of problems, a lot of resentment, a lot of fights. There's also this idea that people with paranoid personality disorder oftentimes will hold these beliefs that people are trying to attack them in all kinds of minuscule ways. And they'll be very obsessive about it. They'll try to dissect what they thought they heard in a conversation, what the hidden meaning was behind when somebody said a certain phrase to you. And obviously that can become quite obsessive and be very difficult for the person in relationship with them to try to talk them down from a ledge, so to speak. And also people with paranoid personality disorder can sometimes be cold and distant in their relationships with others, again, as a means of self-protection. And at other times, they can become extremely controlling and jealous. And as you might imagine, that could be a recipe for disaster for a romantic relationship in terms of feeling like someone is an equal partner and really being able to reason with that person and have good communication with that person.
Because I'm assuming the prevalency rate of PPD it's got to be pretty low, right? Because the nature of the disorder is not likely to attract somebody into a therapist's office to even get this diagnosis in the first place. But if you could speak to the prevalency of PPD and what a supporter could do, whether this is a romantic supporter or a friend or loved one, if they believe that somebody they know has PPD or showing those symptoms, or if they actually have the diagnosis.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, it's estimated that when we're talking about all of the different types of personality disorders, it's estimated that about 10 to 13% of the world's population suffers from some form of personality condition. But interestingly, paranoid personality disorder is actually one of the more common ones. It is estimated, at least in studies of the US, to be somewhere between 2.5 to 4.5% of individuals. Obviously, as you already pointed out, though, how reliable are those statistics? Because there may be people who are not even presenting for these studies, for example, or at treatment so that they can be diagnosed. So the natural inclination is actually that we've underestimated how many people actually have PPD. And so one of the types of things that we watch out for and we consider when somebody does have that personality disorder diagnosis, in particular in this case, the PPD, is how can we help them to move past the diagnosis itself and understand how the symptoms are just affecting their life and hopefully motivating them in some way to want help for those types of symptoms and the causes of some of their distress, as opposed to being really focused on the name of the condition. Because it's really hard, I think, not only to reduce stigma among individuals who have personality disorder diagnoses, but certainly, as you've already alluded to, for somebody who has a paranoid personality disorder, that's very, very hard for them to understand that you're diagnosing them with something to try to help them rather than harm them.
Yes. Yeah. And I want to, because you brought it up, let's talk about diagnosis for a little bit. There is a stigma often with any diagnosis of mental health because there is a natural stigma in mental health. And the reason MedCircle and myself bring up diagnoses and does that count as an actual diagnosis or does it not is because often the diagnoses is what leads treatment. Now, certainly with no diagnoses, you can still treat symptomology. We understand that. But when you get the correct diagnosis, that gives a name about something that you are now working to change or help or better in some way. And so that's why I throw that out there. I know a lot of people will say, hey, stop labeling everybody. The label is only there for help, and you don't have to take the label because at the end of the day, we're still going to treat the symptoms, but what we call it is going to be this big name.
Absolutely. And I think that that's why people should understand that even though diagnoses are never easy to hear, that ultimately it will guide you in the right direction for the type of treatment that's really going to help your life, rather than having a clinician kind of feel in the dark about exactly what's truly going on, and then just applying any kind of haphazard strategy to try to help as things come up, rather than having a really good long-term plan, a treatment plan to help get your life from point A to point B. And so I think that one of the things that people who suffer from paranoid personality disorder, once they have received treatment and once it's taken them a little while, but they've understood, okay, this is my condition, it's actually greatly helped their relationship and their own self-efficacy. Imagine how refreshing it is through treatment and through insight development that you realize that actually people do care a lot more about you than you think. And that instead of having a bunch of people who are always trying to harm you, you actually have some great people who are on your side who want you to flourish. Having those beliefs be your fundamental beliefs can really change a person's life.
And if you're watching this on YouTube and you have a diagnosis and you were happy when you got it, I would love for you to leave a comment, only of course, if you're comfortable, because I know I've had two major diagnoses in my life, Crohn's disease and depression. And I was actually happy to get those because it, for the first time, told me what was going on. Not knowing what's happening for me is a lot scarier than knowing what's going on. And so I actually like it. Label me, please. Okay, so now on the other side of these relationships, there are supporters who really want to be there for somebody who's experiencing paranoia or living with personality or paranoid personality disorder. Are there times when their intervention is not going to be enough and they need to seek immediate help in outside sources?
Definitely think that obviously loved ones, they do the best that they can to help support the person. But if the paranoid individual is becoming a danger to themselves or others, that's criteria number one for needing the professional support. If they're starting to falter in their activities of daily living, they can't really hold down their job, attend to their day-to-day responsibilities of being an employee or a parent, neglecting activities of self-care, no longer able to bathe, dress themselves, and keep up activities that sustain them in their life, that's when you definitely need that immediate support right away. Or if you find that things are just escalating. Sometimes people with paranoid personality disorder, they have this argumentative side of them. They kind of want to always argue with people. They have a lot of verbal fights. But if that becomes physical, that might be another reason for why you might need to get some help right away. And luckily, there's a lot of ways in which you can get these people support. If it's not at the level where you have to hospitalize them against their will, you can call a crisis intervention therapist. You can call somebody who we oftentimes in the business call interventionists to like help you to navigate those next steps into transferring them to the right level of care.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Judy, this has always been informative and eye-opening. I appreciate your time today. And we'll see more of you tonight for our live doctor panel, where you will be able to ask questions to not only Dr. Judy, but our other doctors participating. If you're interested in attending, use the links below this video. If you enjoyed the discussion on personality disorders, MedCircle has a lot more, both right here on YouTube and in our MedCircle membership video library. You can become a member at medcircle.com. You'll get an entire week for free to check it out. We have lots of discounts for professionals, military, and others. You can email support@medcircle.com to get those discounts. I'm Kyle Kittleson. Remember, whatever you're going through, you got this.